The trio, Sam, Colby, and Jake Weber, ventured deeper into the cemetery, their flashlights cutting through the thick fog. The light from their phones provided little comfort as the shadows seemed to dance around them, creating shapes that defied explanation. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the cemetery was trying to pull them down, to keep them within its grasp. As they walked, they noticed strange symbols carved into some of the older tombstones, symbols that Jake recognized from his research into ancient rituals and the occult. These symbols were often used in rituals meant to summon spirits or even demons. The sight of them made Jake's heart race, but he kept his fear in check. This was exactly what they had come for, to confront the unknown. Suddenly Sam stopped in his tracks, holding up a hand to signal the others. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the wind. The others listened closely, and then they heard it too, a faint melody, drifting through the air. It was hauntingly familiar, and as it grew louder, they realized it was Smooth Criminal by Michael Jackson, but distorted, as if being played on an old, broken record player. The music seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper within the cemetery, and without a word, the trio followed the sound. The further they walked, the louder the music became, until they reached a large, decrepit mausoleum. The door was slightly ajar, and the music was clearly coming from within. Jake pushed the door open, and the music stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an eerie silence. The air inside the mausoleum was even colder than outside, and it smelled of mold and decay. The walls were lined with old, crumbling crypts, and in the center of the room was an old cassette player covered in dust. It was the source of the music, but who had turned it on? As they approached the cassette player, they noticed something even more disturbing. Strange markings on the walls, similar to the symbols they had seen on the tombstones. These markings were different, though, more intricate and deliberate. They formed a circle around the cassette player, as if it was the focal point of some dark ritual. Sam reached out to touch the cassette player, but as soon as his fingers brushed against it, the door to the mausoleum slammed shut with a loud bang, plunging them into darkness. Their flashlights flickered, the batteries draining rapidly. A cold, malevolent presence filled the room, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on them, suffocating them with an unseen force. Then, the whispers started. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all around them, speaking in a language none of them could understand. The air grew colder still, and the scent of sulfur filled their nostrils. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized they were not alone in the mausoleum. Something was with them, something evil. The whispers grew louder, more frantic until they reached a deafening crescendo. Jake felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an abyss of darkness and despair. He wanted to run, to get out of the mausoleum and away from whatever was inside, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. Just when it seemed like the pressure would crush them, the whispers stopped, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence once more. The door creaked open on its own, and the cold presence dissipated, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur and decay. The trio stumbled out of the mausoleum, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. They didn't speak for a long moment, each of them trying to process what had just happened. Jake could still feel the lingering cold on his skin, and his mind raced with thoughts of what they had just encountered. This was no ordinary haunting. This was something far more sinister, something that could only be described as demonic. It was said that the Cemetery of Lost Souls was a place where the dead refused to rest. Nestled on the outskirts of Los Angeles, it had a history steeped in mystery and darkness. For years, locals whispered about the strange occurrences within its gates, sightings of ghosts, unexplained sounds, and the eerie feeling of being watched. The cemetery had become infamous on platforms like Reddit, where threads filled with horror stories, analog horror videos, and creepy stories recounted terrifying experiences from those who had dared to visit. Jake Weber, known for his explorations of the supernatural and his collaborations with Sam and Colby, stumbled upon one of these Reddit threads late one night while listening to Linkin Park's In the End. The thread was filled with eerie tales of ghost sightings, demonic encounters, and even a few reports of skinwalkers lurking in the shadows. The cemetery had a reputation that rivaled the most notorious haunted houses, and Jake couldn't resist the allure. As he read through the comments, he noticed a recurring theme. Those who visited the cemetery often returned with more than just stories. They brought something back with them, a curse, a lingering presence, or, in some cases, a dark entity that followed them home. The idea of confronting such evil was both terrifying and exhilarating, and Jake knew he had to experience it for himself. Jake texted Sam and Colby, sharing the details of the cemetery and the strange stories he had found. The trio had tackled haunted locations before, but this felt different. This felt real. The promise of encountering the paranormal, of documenting something truly supernatural, was too tempting to pass up. Within minutes, Sam and Colby were on board, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. As Halloween approached, the trio made their plans. They would visit the Cemetery of Lost Souls, armed with cameras, EMF detectors, and a Ouija board, hoping to capture evidence of the afterlife. Their YouTube channel had seen a spike in viewers after their last few ghost hunting adventures, and this one promised to be the most terrifying yet. The night of their visit, Los Angeles was unusually quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The trio met at Jake's apartment, the air thick with anticipation. Sam had brought along some snacks, including Halloween-themed candy and a flask of whiskey, while Colby had packed the necessary equipment. They knew they had to be prepared for anything, as the stories they had read made it clear that this was no ordinary haunted location. As they drove toward the cemetery, the conversation turned to their favorite horror movies and true crime podcasts. Sam mentioned The Conjuring and how it had sparked his interest in the paranormal, while Colby talked about The Shining and its depiction of psychological horror. Jake, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about the Reddit thread and the warnings from those who had visited the cemetery before them. The cemetery itself was located on the outskirts of the city, far from the bustling streets and bright lights of downtown Los Angeles. The road leading to it was narrow and winding, bordered by thick trees that cast long shadows under the light of the moon. As they approached, the air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their view of the cemetery gates. When they arrived, the cemetery was even more unsettling than they had imagined. The gate, a massive iron structure that had long since rusted, creaked loudly as they pushed it open. The sound echoed through the night, sending a chill down their spines. The air inside the cemetery was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was as if they had stepped into another world, a place where time stood still and the dead walked among the living. The cemetery was vast, with rows upon rows of tombstones, some of which were cracked and broken, while others were overgrown with ivy. The names on the stones were barely legible, worn away by time and the elements. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Jake, Sam, and Colby stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the eerie silence that surrounded them. It was as if the cemetery itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to take their first step into its dark embrace. As they continued to explore the cemetery, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The fog had thickened, reducing their visibility to just a few feet. The tombstones, which had once been merely eerie, now seemed to loom over them, like silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the dead. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment and swallow them whole. They walked in silence, their earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of unease. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what they had experienced in the mausoleum. The symbols, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of dread. It all pointed to something far darker than any of them had anticipated. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had awoken something that had been lying dormant in the cemetery for centuries. Suddenly Colby stopped and pointed ahead. Through the fog, they could see a faint light flickering in the distance. It wasn't the light of their flashlights, but something else entirely. Something unnatural. As they approached, they realized it was coming from a small, run-down chapel at the edge of the cemetery. The chapel was barely standing, its roof caved in and its windows shattered. The door was slightly ajar and the flickering light was coming from within. The trio exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew they had to investigate. This was exactly the kind of place where the paranormal was likely to manifest. They pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked ominously beneath their feet. The light was coming from a single candle placed on the altar at the far end of the chapel. The flame flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As they approached the altar, they noticed something strange. There were objects scattered across it, items that seemed out of place in a chapel. There were old photographs, faded and yellowed with age, showing people long dead. There were trinkets and personal items, things that had clearly been cherished by someone once. But most disturbing of all was the Ouija board, lying in the center of the altar, with the planchette resting on top. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine as he stared at the board. He had used a Ouija board before, but never in a place like this. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the very air was charged with energy. He had a feeling that using the board here would be like opening a door to something they couldn't control. But they had come this far and they couldn't back out now. Sam and Colby nodded in agreement, and the three of them knelt in front of the altar, placing their fingers on the planchette. The candle flickered violently as if it was reacting to their presence, and the room grew colder still. They began to ask questions, starting with the usual. "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette didn't move at first, but after a few moments it began to slowly slide across the board, spelling out a single word: "Yes." A chill ran down Jake's spine. They asked for the spirit's name, but instead of answering, the planchette began to move in a figure-8 pattern, a sign often associated with malevolent entities. The candle flame grew taller, casting twisted shadows on the walls. It felt as if the very walls of the chapel were closing in on them, and the air became thick with a sense of impending doom. Suddenly the planchette stopped, and the room was filled with an ear-piercing scream. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, inhuman and filled with rage. The windows of the chapel shattered, and the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The scream was followed by a deep, guttural growl, and they could feel the presence of something dark and powerful in the room with them. The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a message that sent a wave of terror through them. "Leave now, or you will die." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed the Ouija board and threw it across the room. The growling grew louder, and the candle was snuffed out, plunging the room into complete darkness. They could hear footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate, as if whatever was in the room with them was toying with them, enjoying their fear. Just when it seemed like they were doomed, the growling stopped and the door to the chapel creaked open. The cold presence that had filled the room dissipated, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. They wasted no time in fleeing the chapel, not daring to look back. Chapter 4. The Final Confrontation. The trio ran through the cemetery, their hearts pounding in their chests. The fog was thicker than ever, making it nearly impossible to see where they were going. The tombstones seemed to move in the mist, creating a maze that they couldn't navigate. Every direction they turned led them deeper into the cemetery, as if the very ground was conspiring to keep them there. They could still hear the echo of the growling in their minds, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Jake could sense the presence of the entity they had encountered in the chapel. He could feel it stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and they heard the sound of earth shifting. They looked down to see that the graves around them were opening, the dirt being pushed aside by something from below. The sight was like something out of a horror movie. Bony hands reached out from the graves, grasping at the air, followed by decayed bodies pulling themselves up from the earth. The dead were rising, their hollow eyes fixed on the trio as they shambled forward. Jake, Sam, and Colby backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The cemetery was alive with the dead, and they were surrounded. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. He remembered the symbols they had seen in the mausoleum, the markings that were meant to summon spirits. He realized that they were in the center of a ritual, one that had been designed to trap them in the cemetery and unleash the dead upon them. As the dead closed in, Jake shouted to the others to follow him. He led them to the edge of the cemetery, where they had first entered, but the gate was gone, replaced by a solid wall of fog that seemed impenetrable. The ground beneath them shook, and they heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The entity from the chapel had found them. It emerged from the fog, a towering figure of darkness with glowing red eyes and a mouth filled with jagged teeth. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a creature of pure evil that exuded a sense of dread so powerful it was almost paralyzing. Jake knew they couldn't fight it, but they couldn't run either. They were trapped, and the only way out was to face the entity head-on. He remembered the Ouija board and the message it had spelled out, "Leave now or you will die." It wasn't a warning, it was a command. Jake turned to Sam and Colby, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We have to confront it," he said. "We have to show it that we're not afraid." The others nodded, and they stood their ground as the entity approached. It towered over them, its eyes glowing with malice. But instead of attacking, it simply stared at them as if waiting for them to make the first move. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding out his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not here to harm you," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We're just trying to understand." The entity growled, a low, rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath them. But it didn't attack. Instead, it seemed to consider Jake's words, its red eyes narrowing as if it was thinking. For a moment, the tension in the air lessened, and Jake felt a glimmer of hope. But then, without warning, the entity lunged at them, its claws extended. The ground beneath them gave way, and they fell into darkness. Chapter 5. The curse continues. When they woke up, Jake, Sam, and Colby found themselves lying on the cold, hard ground of the cemetery. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the tombstones. They were disoriented, unsure if what they had experienced was real or just a nightmare. But the dirt on their clothes and the bruises on their bodies told them it was no dream. They hurried out of the cemetery, never looking back. The whispers had stopped, and the air was still, but the fear lingered. They knew they had been lucky to escape with their lives, but the memory of what they had seen and felt would haunt them forever. Back at their apartment, they reviewed the footage from their cameras, hoping to find some explanation, some proof of what had happened. But the videos were distorted, filled with static and strange, eerie sounds. The faces of the ghosts they had seen appeared for brief moments, their eyes full of sorrow and despair. As they watched the footage, they noticed something they hadn't seen before, a figure standing at the entrance of the cemetery, watching them as they left. It was the same shadowy figure from before, but now it was clear. It wasn't a ghost, but something far worse. It was a demon, a being of pure evil that had been released the moment they stepped into the cemetery. The realization hit them hard. They hadn't just visited a haunted cemetery. They had unleashed something ancient and malevolent. And now, it was free to roam the world, spreading its darkness wherever it went. Sam and Colby knew they couldn't stay in Los Angeles any longer. They had to leave, to get as far away from the cemetery of lost souls as possible. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't be enough. The demon would find them, just as it had found the others who had dared to enter the cemetery before them. As they packed their bags ready to flee the city, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They glanced out the window, and there, in the shadows, they saw it. The demon, its eyes glowing red, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. It was waiting for them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as they left their apartment for the last time, they knew they were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. The cemetery of lost souls had claimed many victims over the years, and Jake, Sam, and Colby were just the latest in a long line. The curse would continue, the demon would hunt, and the cemetery would remain a place where the dead never rested, and the living were doomed to join them. The story of the Cemetery of Lost Souls continues, a horror story without end, a true tale of terror that will haunt anyone who dares to hear it. It was not just a story, it was real, a cosmic horror that defied the laws of nature, leaving all who encountered it lost in a world of nightmares and darkness.